Hi everybody, welcome to Gift, and today is the second in our series of our Old Testament survey, or our overview of the Old Testament. Now today we'll be moving on to Numbers, and Numbers is basically talking about in the wilderness. It's the book of wanderings. It's all about the wanderings of all of the tribes of Israel after they left Egypt through the desert, until God would finally let them go over the border into the land of Canaan, the promised land. Now this book was written somewhere between 1450 and 1410 BC, and this was written by Moses. So once again, it takes place over about 37 years, in that perhaps just a little bit more, and we'll explain why here in a moment. But basically, it talks about Israel's wanderings of 37 years, just around and around and around in that desert. They never got to go over. It's a pretty tragic book in many ways. Some really cool things do happen in there. There's some neat miracles that happen in there. But the whole crux of it is that the people fell out of the will of God. Even Moses fell out of the will of God. It's not that Moses, ever worshipped any idols, or he didn't, decide to become a backslider, but he decided that some of his own ways of doing things might be better than the way God told him to do it. And God needed things to be done in a certain way so that his ultimate outcome, many, many eons up the road, would be what God needed it to be, because God's always able to see the long term. And so Moses kind of did some things in a way that he thought better than the way God told him to do. And but people's self-will started taking over. They started worshiping idols. They were doing a lot of different things that they should not have been doing. And God just said, these people are going to go over the land into the land of Canaan and not do what I need done. They're not going to do the assignment that I've given them to do. So we're going to have somebody else do it. We're going to have to wait for the next generation. And once that next generation comes along, then we'll go ahead and send the people over. So let me talk a little bit how that occurred. Basically, when they left Egypt, they traveled. As I said, that probably took about 2 to 3 years. Ended up at the border of the land of Canaan in an area called Kadesh Barnea, right there on the border. And Moses decided to send 12 different spies over and see what it is that they faced ahead of them. Well, the 12 spies went over, and they became kind of frightened about what they saw. They saw giants in the land. I mean, it was full of milk and honey. It was a beautiful land. The fruit was just as gigantic as the people were. There were a lot of positive things about the land, but all they saw were these giants. And they said, you know what? That just felt so overwhelming to them. And out of the 12 spies that went over, 10 of them came back, we cannot do this. And the only 2 that went over that saw it from a positive way and said, let's go get these lands that God has given us, were Joshua and Caleb. And one big difference that I suspect happened is that they did something that we talked about in a previous video, is that they did not look at the land through spiritual eyes, the other 10 spies. But Joshua and Caleb were able to look at it through spiritual eyes. They were able to see that they were going to be able to do whatever God told them to do because they had God on their side. And they were able to see what a beautiful land of milk and honey that God had provided for them. They just needed to go in and get it. But God didn't let them. He kept them wandering around through the desert until the next generation came about. Now, after you get done with Numbers, then you would be going on to the book of Deuteronomy. Now, we're not going to be doing that today. Deuteronomy is not one of our 11 foundational books. But the reason that I bring it up, because Deuteronomy is one of the 5 books of the Torah, and so I'm trying to indicate to you that we're now going out of the Torah, the book of the law, or in the Christian Bible, the Pentateuch, and we're going Now we're going to talk about Joshua, the book of Joshua. And Joshua was written somewhere between 1470 and 1400 BC. And it basically stands for God is salvation. Now, once Moses died, and we'll talk about when we get there in our detailed book study about how he died and what happened. But Joshua then, who was Moses' protege, then took over. He took over as the prophet pretty much of the, not pretty much, he was their prophet. He was not only that, but a spiritual advisor, a go-between between God and the people. He wasn't a priest, but he was a go-between between God and the people. And he was also their military leader. He headed up their military. So huge job he had, more than one job. And over the next 5 to 7 years, the warrior side of Joshua, they went in, they took over the power bases of the different lands of Israel, of all the different people groups that then occupied the land of Canaan. I need to word it that way. And then they moved in. Now they, of course, at that point did not have all the people out of there. There was some cleaning up, some other less powerful groups that they needed to get out of there. And so what he did was they went into Canaan, and then he subdivided all the land up. And he told all the different tribes, he says, you guys go occupy these different lands. And then when you get there, you need to remove all these other people. Now, I'm sure they're dealing with an archaic people. They're going to have to deal with them in an archaic way. So I'm sure, for the most part, that meant killing them. So he sent all the different tribes out to do this, to finish subduing their particular segment of land, and to care for that land and to live in that land. But what happened was they didn't do it that way. They all got into these different lands and basically just started living with the people, took up many of their attributes, many of their habits, and started practicing their worship of other gods and idols, even child sacrifice to the god Molech. And we'll talk about that. They used to actually get these children and somehow put them inside of a metal statue, and then put the metal statue over fire and burn the child to death. And that was how they sacrificed the child. So that tells you the type of people that they were having to deal with, and why God did not want the Israelites living amongst them, and actually why he needed to deal with them in this archaic way. I am sure that God had tried to find some way to speak to the hearts of these people, and they just would not do it. And now here were the Israelites coming in and basically taking on the same things. They didn't do what God told them to do, and it leads to even further problems that we're going to see here in a moment. But basically the conquest takes about 5 to 7 years, but the entire book goes over a period of about 30 years, the book of Joshua. Now, as we go, you're going to start to see that some of these books do overlay each other. Events from one book, will also have occurred at the tail end of another book. And we're now going to go to the book of Judges. Now, this book was written somewhere between 1050 and 1000 BC. And I'm going to turn my camera just a little bit here because I don't want to strain my neck quite so much. This actually covers a very dark time in Jewish history, or the history of Israel. During this time, the time of Judges, there was not really any kind of civil or secular government, not really an organized government. They were a people ruled by God, and through the spokesperson that God elected. So it would be appointed by God, would be a judge or / prophet. And that's how the nation was ruled, and that's how God had originally intended it to happen. God was the supreme ruler, and then this judge was a type of a deliverer / prophet. And they were together in that they all fell under the headship of this prophet, of these judges. But they started refusing to obey the laws of Moses at all. And you remember all through the wanderings through the desert, that grumble. Well, it just continued, and then it got to the point they just weren't obeying the laws at all. And they started into this repetitive cycle over and over and over again. where they would fall into sin and disbelief, worshiping other gods, backsliding, and then they would become captive by the people that they were living with there in the land. The people that they were originally told needed to be removed, that they did not do what God told them to do. They would end up being slaves and captives of those people. Then here would come this deliverer, this judge God sent in to remind them of who they were, what they needed to do. They would come out of bondage with those people, and for short periods of time everything would be okay. And then they would start right back into the same cycle again. Sin, disbelief, worshiping other gods, being held captive. Then another judge or deliverer would have to come. Now you can still see this pattern that we as people, we as human beings, continue to do this today. If you look around us, it continues. It's a cycle over and over again. And they went through multitudes of these different judges. I'm not going to read the different judges or deliverers. I'm not going to read the names of all of them that God sent. We'll do that when we do the detailed study of this book at some point in the future. But just so you understand that Samuel was the last of all the judges, the prophet judges. He was the very last one. Before they ended up in a monarchy period. So, but while we were still in here, they just, this whole period of time where the cycles occurred over and over again in the book of Judges lasted about 332 years. And as I said, Samuel was the last judge. And under Samuel, the people were finally, when they first... Let me kind of stop here and explain something a little bit here, or the way that I see it. When the people left out of Egypt, they were like babies. They didn't know how to govern themselves their entire lives, and for the lives of all their predecessors, from the time Israel first stepped into Egypt, they had been told what to do, how to do everything. They weren't allowed to make decisions on their own. They did not live anything on their own. They had to be allowed to do anything that they did. They were slaves, and totally also infiltrated by a lot of the beliefs and behavioral systems out of Egypt. So basically, they were infants in learning the ways of God. They were starting all over as babes, and God was trying to get them to advance to the next level of childhood. So they were like little babies. They never got to go anywhere. God gives them all of these rules, very archaic rules, because they were a society that was archaic, and He had to get down on their level, just like you have to get down on your child's level to teach them how to live. So that's what God had to do with these people. But He finally kind of feels like they're ready to advance to the next level of childhood. So I don't know if that's toddlerhood or young childhood, as a young child. But they're ready to go from being an infant, but they still have to have spankings because they're not, their self-will and their fleshly desires still overpower their desire to live the lives God would have them to live and to do the things God would have them to do. But they finally did kind of transition over from being infants. I'm going to call it toddlerhood, and we're more of a cohesive group of people. And they finally became united, but at this point they were transferring. They ended up deciding they wanted to have a king. They did not like that's what all the people around them had. They thought that looked pretty good to them. So we don't any longer want to have a government that is ruled by God. We want to have a government that is ruled by a king, a monarchy. And the people requested that. And so finally, after going back and forth quite a bit about it, God said, fine, if that's what you want to do, you got it. Let's go for it. So He told Samuel to anoint a king, and that's what Samuel did. And so then we go into the monarchy period. And the first book that we're going to discuss in regards to the monarchy period had to do with the united monarchy. You remember earlier we had discussed there was the divided and then the united. So the first part of this monarchy period, they were still a united people. And in Samuel 1, one of the first events that happens is the prophet Samuel, the judge Samuel, anoints the first king, and that is Saul. Now, always prophets, priests, judges, and kings, during that period of time, they all had to be anointed with oil. That was part of how they were put into their position. And by the way, I don't remember if I said, but the books Samuel 1 and later on when we talk about Samuel 2, those books were written about 930 BC, possibly a little bit later. Now, the dates that the things happened were, a little bit earlier than 930 BC, but it wasn't actually taken pen to paper till a little bit later. So all of Israel did unite around Saul. They agreed for him to be their king. After all, they had begged God for a king. And this transitioned Israel from a loose kind of a tribal confederacy to a central man-made government. And Saul started out, everything was going fine. He did a good job at first. He was in the will of God. He did what God told him to do. And he worked closely with Samuel to get that all done. But that didn't last long. It seems like power gets to people sometimes, and we see that in many aspects of life still today. And power people can either become a tyrannical leader, and they may have started off good at the beginning, or they can even become money hungry and just desire more and more money. It affects people in different ways. Well, Saul, there was some evidence that he had some mental health issues, but nonetheless, he totally, no matter what the cause of it was, there was self-will involved with it. And he totally fell out of the will of God, started ruling things and doing things in the way that he wanted to do it. And so Samuel just says, we're going to have to get somebody else. And he goes ahead and anoints David king. He spent time with God. God told him, you need to anoint. And he went and found the young man that God told him to anoint. And now David did not become king right away. He went on, there were a lot of exploits and events that happened in between him actually becoming king. First he killed Goliath, had many other military exploits. The people began to love him more than they loved Saul. Saul became very, very jealous and just started trying to kill David. Now, David never wanted to kill Saul. David did everything he could to avoid hurting Saul. He had many opportunities to kill Saul. All the time hiding out in the caves, hiding out in that desert. And if you downloaded on eSword any of the map applications, I can't remember which application it is. I highly recommend that you do download the maps. It'll help you not only with understanding some of the things that we're talking about, but also looking at some of the events that are happening in the world today as we study looking at the maps that go along with the time frame that we're talking about. Now, in one of the areas, in one of those map applications, you'll need to go through them and look. There's a map in there that shows the wanderings of David. I mean, for me, that kind of thing is fascinating. So that's something that you can take a look at and see actually where all David wandered during the time that Saul was chasing him down. But eventually, Saul died during a battle with the Philistines, and his son Jonathan, who had actually become really close friends with David and was even close friends with David during the time he was in hiding, was also sadly killed in this battle. So eventually we get to the end of Samuel 1 and we get into the second book of Samuel, and David ascends the throne that he had been anointed for. Now when he first ascends the throne, he's only the king over southern Israel. The other tribes didn't quite go along with all that had happened, and there had been some other conflicts, so they really weren't quite sure about this, and they just kind of stood back for a little bit. But eventually he does end up being king over both the northern and the southern kingdoms. They weren't really a divided kingdom, but there were some times in there when the people just disagreed on things and didn't necessarily do what, didn't follow, kind of did the northern kingdom kind of did their own thing periodically, off and on. But they did eventually all agree that they wanted David to be their king. And so, for a good deal of David's reign, his struggle wasn't, there were battles with the Philistines, all kinds of things, but his main struggle was with himself. He had a lot of fleshly desires. He was a physically oriented person, and he liked women, and all these different things get him into trouble. And he had the affair with Bathsheba. Ultimately, even though it wasn't by his own hands, but he had it done, he murdered her husband. And there were many, many other things. He always was deeply in love with God, but it was a constant battle between David had with his flesh. And, what ended up happening, at some point Samuel had died, and the prophet Nathan was then took his place. And Nathan comes and tells David, I realize you've repented to God for all these things, but you're going to have to now suffer the consequences. You've caused this cascading effect. There's always an effect from your sin, whether you see it now, whether it's seen 20 years up the road, or whether it affects somebody else. There's a reason that it's a sin, and there's always a consequence for it. And it's not that God causes the consequence or wanted them to, although sometimes he will, because he's got to get things back on track. But basically there were consequences to David's sin, and it involved his son died, tens of thousands of the people that he reigned over died, and then he ended up once again having to go into hiding from his own son Absalom, because Absalom just got greedy, wanted the kingdom. And I don't know why David did not have the strength enough to take care of that, but he went into hiding again in the caves, and Absalom was meanwhile trying to take over his kingdom, trying to kill his dad, which is amazing. Like I say, they were archaic people back then. And eventually, at some point, David is back on his throne, and we come to the end of that section. We get into the divided monarchy, and that begins in Kings 1. And David is an old man when we very first start reading Kings 1, and he ends up appointing Solomon as king before he dies, because there was some conflict about that between Solomon and one of David's other son. But he ends up appointing Solomon king, and after he dies, Solomon assumes the throne. This all is happening about this book was written about 550 BCs. But Solomon builds a temple to replace the tabernacle, and when Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam is then the king. And this is when we start to run into more problems again. The kingdom is still pretty united underneath Solomon, but Solomon caused some problems, for all the wisdom, the reputation for being a wise person that Solomon was. He loved his lavish lifestyle. He loved women. He took after his dad on that car. Now, he loved God, but yet on the other hand, he did some bad things. He had a couple of those bad things had to do with the building of the temple. It's a good thing that he built the temple, but he basically enslaved his people to do it. And then the other thing that he did was he put them under a very, very heavy tax burden. It just couldn't be met, and it left them very, very poor. And so there was rebellion in their midst over this. And especially from those of the northern kingdom. They were the other tribes other than the tribe of Judah. And they were like, hey, why do we have to put up with this? So they sent a representative, Jeroboam, once Rehoboam became king, they sent Jeroboam in to talk to him. They said, listen, your dad is gone. We really would like for you to lift this tax burden and quit and start treating your people better. Quit treating them as slaves. You know, Rehoboam was pretty stubborn. He just says, no way. This worked for my dad. I really like the way this turned out for my dad. I like this life. I like all these golden riches around here. So no, we're not changing it. Things are staying the way they are. And he did not listen to Jeroboam at all. Jeroboam left. They ended up in civil war. And this, as a result of the civil war, the kingdoms totally separated again. You had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So the northern kingdom was called Israel. And basically it occupied the area you may have heard of, Samaria. And so that was all the other tribes other than the tribe of Judah. Now the tribe of Judah remained under King Rehoboam, and that's the area where Jerusalem was at. And that's the tribe of Judah, and that land was called Judah. So they separated out into those two sections. So and what ultimately happens, because this is not in the will of God, is each tribe comes to a tragic end. They're kind of on their own. They lose their protection because they're not doing what God would have them do. He's trying, you know, he's constantly trying to redirect them to where they're safe, where they're doing what they need to do, and where they're within the will of God. But, you know, it's just that same cycle over and over again. Now we get to 2 Kings, and 2 Kings is written about 550 BC, but the events in it actually started occurring about 725 BC. And in 725 BC, the northern kingdom, which, remember, that is Israel, they live in Samaria, basically totally destroyed and obliterated. The men were all killed. There were no men left. Probably a lot of the women were killed. There probably were some that scattered, and a matter of fact, they're pretty sure that they were. Some that weren't home, you know, out of town when it happened. But in large, for all practical purposes, they were obliterated and no longer in existence. That the Assyrians came in and did this. They just obliterated them. Once again, it was an archaic time. And now the women that were left there, they were either raped and pillaged, or they were forced into marriage with the Assyrians and reproduced children, and these children created a new race of people, the Samaritans, which you will continue to hear about through the Bible. Now the Samaritans, even up to this day, you know, especially in biblical times, they were not liked. They were not considered part of Israel at all anymore, because they were not pure-blooded. And even today, in this day and age, I have heard some Jewish people refer to them as half-breeds. So, and there are still some Sumerian descendants of these people left. There's a small village in Israel where there's Samaritans left. It's a small village. To their knowledge, this is the only group of them left. And they are the descendants, the only descendants left at all that they know of the other tribes. But they're not welcomed as the other tribes. They're not treated as the other tribes. They're treated as another people group. Now, then, shortly after that, what follows is the tribe of Judah. Now, they are not all totally obliterated. We know that God had a plan for that tribe, and He had a plan from the beginning for that tribe of people, and He needed to try to find a way to get it carried out. And what ended up happening was in 605 BC, Judah was taken into captivity by the Babylonians. Jerusalem was totally destroyed. They were taken in ball and chains, I suppose, but they were marched off to Babylon and totally removed from their land. And this is a cycle that you see over and over again throughout history with them. And they were taken captive, and at first ended up living as slaves in Babylon. I mean, only for 70 or 80 years or so they were there. But this ended the monarchy period. The temple was destroyed. As I said, Judah exiled as captives in Babylon. Israel was totally missing, no longer there at all, the nation of Israel. So they were the nation of Judah, and they were kept captive in Babylon. So nobody had anything that God had wanted them to have, and nobody was in the promised land anymore. Now we then go into the post-exilic period, and we are just about out of time, but I want to go ahead and cover this really quick. That's basically the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and we're not going to really do an overview of those books. I'm just going to say that Ezra was written about 456 to 444 BC. Nehemiah was written about 445 to 425 BC. And this covers the post-exilic period. This is after the 70 to 80 years had happened. The Persians had taken over Babylon. And there's a long story, a very interesting story to how it all happened. But King Cyrus said, those that want to stay here and remain citizens can do so. Those of you that want to return back to Israel, rebuild your land and rebuild your temple, can take all your temple treasures. We've got them in storage for you. Take them and go back to your land of Judah. So a few of them did. Most of them chose to stay in Babylon. They had acclimated there. A lot of them intermarried and disappeared. Others still kept themselves separate as Judah. They just did not return back to their lands. They stayed there and practiced their religion and kept that group of people kept their seed line pure, but they liked living there. They liked the land that they lived in at that point, so they stayed. So tomorrow we will start getting into kind of a pre-Genesis talk about the book of Genesis, but you have basically just finished an overview of the entire Old Testament in two approximately 30-minute periods over 2 days. So I want you to see that it is not going to be difficult to study the Old Testament. And actually the events that happened in there, once we get into these stories, they're very exciting. So I really look forward to talking to you tomorrow as we get into our first book of the Bible. We're going to kind of do an introductory lesson to that book, which is Genesis, and then we'll get into our study. And this study will go on for a while. I can't tell you how many days it will take. It's a long book. But it will take a while, but it won't seem like we're in the same book because so many events, there's so many of our basic biblical stories that are in that book. But in the meanwhile, I'd like you to remember that we are all in the service of our Heavenly Father. Please pray tonight after the lesson to ask the Lord to show you whatever it is that He wanted you to garner from this lesson, and then pray before tomorrow's lesson. And remember, I love you, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.